The overlooked human deep in the mechanical heart of the mining vessel. Crimson Harvest, Elena Vasquez crawled through a maintenance tunnel barely wide enough for her shoulders. The tunnel walls hummed with the vibration of massive ore processors above, and the air tasted of metal dust and recycled oxygen. She had been working in these forgotten spaces for 6 hours straight, replacing corroded power conduits that the ship's primary systems claimed were functioning normally. Elena knew, better. The diagnostic computers might show green lights across the board, but she could feel the ship's pain in every rivet and wire. The Crimson Harvest was dying slowly, and she was the only one who seemed to notice. Above her, through the deck plating, she could hear the heavy footsteps of the alien crew members going about their duties. The ship carried representatives from 8 different species, all united in their certainty that humans belonged at the bottom of the galactic hierarchy. To them, Elena was just another piece of maintenance equipment, useful for crawling into spaces too small for their superior forms. Captain Thex was a saurian, standing nearly 9 feet tall with scales that shifted from deep green to bronze depending on his mood. His species had been exploring space when humans were still discovering fire, or so he liked to remind everyone during his frequent speeches about galactic civilization. The captain had spoken directly to Elena exactly 3 times in her 18 months aboard the Crimson Harvest, and each time it had been to deliver criticism about her work pace. Chief Engineer Voss was a hexapod, a species that had evolved 6 arms and a brain capable of processing multiple complex calculations simultaneously. His kind had designed the Crimson Harvest's primary systems, and he never let anyone forget it. To Voss, humans were an evolutionary dead end, barely capable of understanding technology that his people had mastered centuries ago. He assigned Elena the tasks he considered beneath his attention, maintaining systems that were old, outdated, or simply too tedious for a superior mind to bother with. Security Chief Cran belonged to the Mantari, an insectoid species known for their discipline and strategic thinking. Cran's compound eyes could process visual information across 17 different spectrums, and his reflexes were faster than most computers. He viewed humans as soft, weak creatures who had somehow managed to stumble into space travel through sheer luck rather than any real competence. The other crew members represented species from across the galaxy, each bringing their own particular form of superiority complex. The Etherians could manipulate electromagnetic fields with their minds. The Christics could interface directly with computer systems through bio-neural connections. The Voidwalkers could survive in the vacuum of space for hours without protection. Every species on the ship had evolved abilities that seemed to make humans obsolete. But Elena had something none of them possessed: the ability to see the whole picture. While the hexapod engineer focused on his sophisticated calculations and the Christec technicians merged their consciousness with the ship's computers, Elena watched everything. She noticed that the power distribution grid was running at dangerous efficiency levels, with no margin for emergency situations. She observed that the hull stress indicators were showing microfractures in 17 different locations, fractures that would become catastrophic failures if the ship encountered any unusual gravitational stresses. She realized that the ore processing systems were operating beyond their design specifications, creating harmonic vibrations that were slowly shaking the entire vessel apart. Most importantly, Elena had discovered something that made her blood run cold every time she thought about it. During routine maintenance in the communication array, she had found evidence of unauthorized data transmissions. Someone or something had been monitoring the Crimson Harvest's operations, tracking their mining routes, recording their cargo manifests, and analyzing their defensive capabilities. The transmissions were sophisticated, using encryption methods that suggested military-grade intelligence gathering. Elena had tried to report her discoveries to Chief Engineer Voss 3 weeks ago. She had prepared detailed documentation, complete, with sensor readings and analysis reports. She had requested just 5 minutes of his time to present evidence that the ship was in serious danger. Voss had listened for exactly 37 seconds before dismissing her concerns as human paranoia. Humans, he explained with the patience one might show to a child, were not evolved enough to understand the complexity of modern spacecraft systems. What Elena interpreted as problems were simply normal operational parameters that her primitive brain could not comprehend. He suggested she focus on the simple maintenance tasks she was actually qualified to perform, and leave the real engineering to species that had brains capable of handling it. Elena had also attempted to approach Captain Thex directly, violating the ship's chain of command protocols. The Saurian captain had been in the middle of reviewing mining reports when Elena appeared in his office doorway. Before she could speak a single word about her discoveries, Thex had erupted in fury about human insubordination. He had confined her to quarters for 2 days and assigned her to the most unpleasant maintenance duties available as punishment for her presumption. Security Chief Cran had been her last hope. Surely someone responsible for the ship's safety would want to know about unauthorized surveillance and potential structural failures. But Cran had cut her off before she could finish explaining about the data transmissions. Humans, he informed her, were known throughout the galaxy for their tendency toward conspiracy theories and irrational fears. The Mantari had evolved beyond such primitive emotional responses. If there were real security threats, his advanced sensory systems would have detected them long before a human could stumble across them, so Elena had stopped trying to warn them. Instead, she had begun preparing for the disaster she knew was coming, working during off-duty hours, using tools and materials that she technically had no authorization to access. Elena began making modifications to the Crimson Harvest systems. She rerouted power conduits to create backup circuits that bypassed the main distribution grid. She installed manual override controls in critical systems that were normally controlled only by computer. She fabricated emergency repair materials and hid them in maintenance areas throughout the ship. She even created alternative communication systems using components salvaged from obsolete equipment. The work was dangerous and exhausting. Elena had to be careful never to trigger automated security systems that would alert the crew to her activities. She had to make her modifications appear to be routine maintenance, disguising major system changes as minor repairs. She had to work in complete silence, often in uncomfortable positions, always listening for the approach of other crew members who might discover what she was doing. The other humans on the ship thought Elena was antisocial. There were 12 humans in the crew, all assigned to maintenance and service positions. The others had adapted to their low status by forming tight social groups, spending their off-duty time together, complaining about alien prejudice while accepting their fate. They invited Elena to join their gatherings, but she always declined. She had work to do. Elena's background was something she never discussed with her fellow crew members. Before joining the Crimson Harvest, she had spent 8 years as a systems engineer in the Human Defense Force. She had kept military installations running during siege conditions, when enemy fire was systematically destroying infrastructure, and every jury-rigged repair could mean the difference between survival and annihilation. She had learned to see failures before they happened, to create solutions using whatever materials were available, and to never give up no matter how impossible the situation appeared. The Human Defense Force had taught her that humans had one advantage over every other species in the galaxy. They never knew when to quit. Other species were stronger, faster, smarter, and more technologically advanced. But when everything went wrong, when all the sophisticated systems failed and all the careful plans fell apart, humans kept working. They improvised, adapted, and found ways to make the impossible happen. Elena could feel that moment approaching. The ship's vibrations were growing worse each day. The unauthorized transmissions were becoming more frequent and more detailed. The stress fractures in the hull were expanding at an accelerating rate. Chief Engineer Voss continued to insist that all systems were operating normally, but Elena knew that normal operation on the Crimson Harvest was a carefully maintained illusion. She had finished her work on the backup power systems and was moving on to structural reinforcement when the first alarm sounded. It was a minor alert, indicating a fluctuation in the artificial gravity generators. The duty engineer, a young Christek named Zenth, reset the system and logged it as a routine anomaly. Elena knew better. The gravity fluctuation was exactly the kind of cascade failure she had been expecting. The first domino in a chain reaction that would bring down every major system on the ship. She gathered her tools and prepared to move to the gravity generator maintenance area. If her calculations were correct, They had perhaps 6 hours before the generators failed completely. After that, everything else would follow in a sequence of disasters that would leave the Crimson Harvest helpless in space. The alien crew members continued their duties, confident in their technological superiority and completely unaware that their ship was beginning to die around them. They had dismissed the quiet human engineer as irrelevant, a primitive being whose concerns were not worth their attention. They were about to discover just how wrong they could be. When everything falls apart. The attack began at 0347 ship time, during the quiet hours when most of the crew was asleep, and the Crimson Harvest was drifting through the Kepler mining sector, with her defenses in minimal readiness mode. Elena was awake as she had been for the past 36 hours, making final adjustments to the emergency systems she had been secretly installing throughout the ship. She was deep in a maintenance shaft near the main reactor, when the first proximity alarms began screaming. Through the ship's hull, she could feel the vibrations of high-energy weapons charging. Elena's experience with the Human Defense Force told her exactly what those vibrations meant. Military-grade particle cannons, at least 6 of them, probably, mounted on vessels designed specifically for attacking mining ships. The Crimson Harvest shuddered as the first volley of enemy fire struck her hull. Elena heard the distinctive sound of armor plating being vaporized, followed by the hiss of atmosphere escaping through new holes in the ship's skin. The attackers knew exactly where to hit for maximum damage with minimum effort. They had detailed intelligence about the ship's construction and defensive capabilities. Captain Thex's voice echoed through the communication system, distorted by interference from the enemy weapons. All crew to emergency stations. We are under attack by unknown hostiles. Security teams to defensive positions. Engineering teams to damage control stations. Elena grabbed her emergency toolkit and began moving through the maintenance tunnels, toward the areas where she knew the most critical damage would occur. She had studied the ship's structural weaknesses for months, and she knew exactly which systems would fail first under coordinated attack. The gravity generators went offline, 30 seconds later, exactly as Elena had predicted. The artificial gravity that kept everyone's feet on the deck suddenly vanished, leaving crew members floating helplessly in corridors throughout the ship. Elena heard screams and shouts of confusion as aliens who had never trained for zero gravity combat struggled to orient themselves. But Elena had spent years working in zero gravity during her military service. She used handholds and guide cables to move quickly through the ship's interior, reaching the primary damage control station just as Chief Engineer Voss was attempting to assess the situation. Voss was floating near a control console, his 6 arms flailing as he tried to operate controls designed for use in normal gravity. His sophisticated hexapod brain was having difficulty processing the multiple system failures that were cascading through the ship's networks. The primary power grid is failing, Voss announced, his voice filled with confusion. The damage should not be this extensive. The enemy weapons are not powerful enough to cause these system failures. Elena pushed herself to a nearby console and began calling up damage reports. What she saw confirmed her worst fears. The attackers had struck the exact locations where she knew the ship was most vulnerable. They had targeted the stress fractures in the hull that Elena had tried to warn about, turning minor structural flaws into major breaches. They had overloaded the power distribution system that was already running beyond safe parameters. They had created exactly the cascade of failures that Elena had been preparing for. The hull breaches are expanding, Elena called out, reading from her console. We're losing atmosphere in sections C through G. The ore processing systems are offline, and the main reactor is showing instability warnings. Voss turned his compound eyes toward Elena with an expression of annoyance. Human, you are not qualified to interpret those readings. Return to your assigned station and leave damage. Assessment to trained engineers. At that moment, the main reactor alarms began screaming. The containment field that held the ship's power source was fluctuating dangerously, and if it failed completely, the resulting explosion would vaporize the entire vessel. Elena looked at the reactor status display and realized they had perhaps 20 minutes before total containment failure. The reactor containment is collapsing, Elena said, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. The cooling system is damaged and the magnetic field generators are offline. If we don't stabilize it immediately, we're all going to die. Voss attempted to access the reactor controls, but his six-armed interface technique was useless in zero gravity. Without the stability of normal gravity, he could not maintain the precise coordination needed to operate complex systems. I cannot reach the manual controls, he admitted. The interface requires gravitational orientation. Elena pushed herself toward the reactor control station. I can do it, she said. I've worked on similar systems before. Impossible, Voss replied. Reactor containment requires advanced calculations that human brains cannot perform. You would only make the situation worse. Elena ignored him and began working on the reactor controls. Her fingers moved across the interface with practiced efficiency, calling up diagnostic displays and system schematics that she had memorized during her months of unauthorized study. She could see exactly what needed to be done to stabilize the containment field, but it would require bypassing safety protocols and using the backup system she had secretly installed. What are you doing? Voss demanded. Those are not standard procedures. Standard procedures aren't going to work, Elena replied, her hands moving rapidly across the control surfaces. The damage is too extensive. We need to reroute power through the backup circuits and manually balance the magnetic field generators. There are no backup circuits in the reactor system, Voss said. The original design did not include such redundancies. Elena smiled grimly as she activated the circuits she had spent weeks installing. There are now. The reactor containment field stabilized just as another volley of enemy fire struck the ship. This time, Elena was ready for the impact. She had braced herself against the control console and continued working even as the ship shook around her. Security Chief Cran's voice came through the communication system, tight with strain. Engineering. We need power to the defensive systems. Our weapons are offline and our shields are failing. Elena looked at the power distribution display and saw that the main grid was indeed failing, exactly as she had warned it would. But the backup power circuits she had installed were still functional. I can reroute power to the weapon systems, she called out, but I'll need to shut down non-essential systems to do it. Do it, Captain Thex's voice commanded over the communication system. Whatever it takes to get our defenses back online. Elena began transferring power through her hidden backup circuits, bringing the ship's defensive systems back to life. As the weapons powered up, she heard the distinctive whine of particle cannons charging for return fire. But the attackers had expected the Crimson Harvest to be helpless by now. They had positioned themselves for a boarding action, moving their ships close enough to deploy assault teams. They had not anticipated that their target would suddenly come back to life with fully charged weapons. The Crimson Harvest's counterattack caught the enemy ships completely by surprise. Elena's power rerouting had not only restored the defensive systems but had actually increased their output by bypassing damaged relays and using more efficient power paths. The mining ship's weapons were suddenly hitting harder than they were designed to hit. Elena could hear the sounds of enemy ships exploding as the Crimson Harvest's weapons found their targets. The attack that was supposed to be a quick boarding action had turned into a real fight, and the attackers were discovering that their intelligence about the mining ship's capabilities was dangerously incomplete. How is this possible? Chief Engineer Voss asked, staring at Elena as she continued to work at the control stations. You have restored systems that should be completely offline. You have rerouted power through circuits that do not exist in the ship's original design. Elena continued working, her fingers dancing across multiple control interfaces simultaneously. I've been making modifications for months, she said. I tried to warn everyone that the ship was vulnerable, but nobody wanted to listen to a human engineer. Captain Thex's voice came through the communication system again, this time with a note of amazement. Engineering, our weapons are operating at 112% of rated capacity. Our shields are stronger than they've ever been. How are you achieving this? Elena activated another set of backup systems, bringing additional hull repair mechanisms online. I've been preparing for this attack since I discovered the surveillance devices that were monitoring our operations. I knew they would strike when we were most vulnerable, and I knew exactly which systems would fail first. Security Chief Cran appeared in the engineering section, moving with the practiced grace of someone who had trained for zero-gravity combat. His compound eyes focused on Elena with an expression she had never seen before. Respect. You knew about surveillance devices? Cran asked. Why was I not informed of this security breach? Elena looked up from her control console, where she was coordinating repairs to 3 different hull breaches simultaneously. I tried to inform you 3 weeks ago. You told me that humans were too primitive to understand real security threats, and that your advanced senses would have detected any actual problems. Cran's insectoid features showed what might have been embarrassment. I remember that conversation. I did not listen to your concerns. None of you listened, Elena replied, turning back to her work. But I kept working anyway. I knew that when everything fell apart, someone would need to put it back together again. The ship shuddered as the last of the attacking vessels was destroyed. Elena's modifications had turned what should have been a massacre into a complete victory for the Crimson Harvest. The mining ship was damaged but functional. Her crew was alive, and her attackers were nothing but debris floating in space. Chief Engineer Voss floated beside Elena, watching as she continued to coordinate repairs with an efficiency that his sophisticated brain could barely follow. How did you learn to perform these calculations? He asked. How did you design these system modifications? This level of engineering should be beyond human capabilities. Elena finished stabilizing the hull breach repairs and turned to face Voss. I spent 8 years as a senior systems engineer with the Human Defense Force, she said. I kept military installations running during siege conditions. I designed backup systems for facilities that were under constant attack. I learned to make any system work, no matter how damaged it might be. The aliens around her absorbed this information in stunned silence. They had assumed Elena was just another maintenance worker, someone whose only qualification was her ability to fit into small spaces. They had never considered that she might have skills and experience that exceeded their own. Captain Thex's voice came through the communication system one final time. Elena Vasquez, report to the bridge immediately. We need to discuss your new position as Chief of Emergency Systems. Elena gathered her tools and prepared to leave the engineering section. Around her, the alien crew members who had ignored her for 18 months were looking at her with expressions of amazement and newfound respect. Chief Engineer Voss spoke as she reached the corridor entrance. Elena, I owe you an apology. I was wrong about human capabilities. I was wrong about your capabilities. Elena paused and looked back at the hexapod engineer. You weren't wrong about everything, she said. Humans aren't stronger or faster or smarter than other species, but we have one advantage that you seem to have forgotten about. What advantage is that? Voss asked. Elena smiled as she pushed herself through the corridor entrance, moving toward the bridge where Captain Thex was waiting to offer her the recognition she had earned. We never know when to quit.